Three companies most people never think about now hold more influence over daily life than most elected leaders, because they quietly became the largest owners of the businesses people rely on every single day. Their power grew unnoticed, and the consequences are only beginning. Most people never stop to wonder who truly controls the companies that guide their routines, yet this hidden power structure affects everything from the prices they accept to the stability they depend on, shaping life quietly in the background. This quiet shift in control happened while people focused on work, family, and routine, unaware that corporate ownership was becoming concentrated in ways that allowed a handful of financial giants to influence choices across the entire economy. The names BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street rarely appear in everyday conversations, yet together they have gathered an influence so large that it now touches nearly every major company shaping modern life. Each of these firms manages sums that dwarf the budgets of many countries, giving them a level of financial leverage that creates real-world effects most people feel without ever understanding where those pressures come from. Their combined money under management sits in the tens of trillions, an amount large enough to sway industries, move markets, and shift priorities for the biggest corporations in the world without any dramatic public announcements. This power did not grow through major news events or sudden takeover attempts, but through a steady rise in passive investing that funneled enormous sums into these firms through ordinary accounts people trusted for simple long-term savings. As retirement planning became automated and index funds became a default choice, millions unknowingly sent their money into the same small group of managers, strengthening the influence of the Big Three with each passing contribution. What seemed like harmless diversification actually concentrated ownership across countless industries, creating an invisible web of control that ties grocery chains, tech companies, airlines, and banks all under the voting power of the same institutions. This overlapping ownership reduces real competition because the same groups benefit no matter which company wins, allowing them to influence industry directions from a distance most people never see. The question many never think to ask is what this level of silent control means for the future, because the real power lies not in ownership alone, but in the decisions these firms get to shape inside corporate boardrooms. Most people picture retirement accounts as safe boxes for the future, yet these accounts feed streams of money into index funds that give enormous voting weight to the Big Three, magnifying their influence with every paycheck. Index funds remove the need to choose individual stocks, but at the same time they hand responsibility for the underlying votes to the companies managing them, which means trillions in shareholder power ends up in very few hands. This creates an automatic system where ordinary people unknowingly fuel the growth of institutions that increasingly guide corporate behavior, not because of intention, but because of how the system naturally funnels power upward. Every time someone invests in a common retirement account, a small fraction of their money helps strengthen these firms, allowing them to increase their influence without needing to convince anyone to hand over direct control. Trillions accumulate from countless small contributions, turning the Big Three into gatekeepers for the corporate world and giving them a level of sway that few elected officials could ever match. Few organizations in history have ever gathered money at this speed or this scale, making the Big Three among the most powerful financial entities ever created. Driven by a system that grows on autopilot, passive investing reshaped the market by rewarding size and stability, which benefited the Big Three more than anyone else, helping them accumulate ownership in companies faster than almost any competitor could challenge. This growth made them permanent owners of corporate America, because index funds do not buy and sell based on strategy, but remain locked into the same companies, giving the Big Three long-term influence across every major sector. With long-term ownership comes long-term power, allowing the Big Three to guide the direction of major corporations even when individual investors have no idea their money plays a role in such decisions. The real question becomes how these firms actually use this voting power, because behind closed doors they influence decisions that ripple outward into jobs, prices, consumer choices, and the stability of entire communities. Stock ownership determines who gets to speak during company votes, and the Big Three control such large portions of many corporations that their voices automatically carry more weight than nearly anyone else involved. They hold significant positions in the biggest technology companies, gaining indirect influence over the platforms people use daily, the data policies that shape digital life, and the direction of future innovation. Their reach extends into the largest banks, giving them influence over lending practices, interest rate reactions, and financial strategies that shape the housing market and the credit environment millions rely on. Their ownership of food and agriculture companies ties them to the supply chains that determine grocery prices, product availability, and the decisions that shape how major food brands operate worldwide. They also appear in the shareholder lists of energy companies, utilities, and infrastructure providers, giving them a role in shaping how power grids evolve, how energy prices shift, and how major environmental decisions unfold. Their presence inside media companies adds another layer of influence, because their ownership links them to the networks, platforms, and production studios that shape public conversations, even when most viewers have no idea these financial giants sit behind the scenes. Their reach into airlines and travel companies allows them to affect decisions tied to routes, pricing structures, corporate strategies, and industry partnerships, connecting them to a sector millions depend on for work, vacations, and family travel. Once you map their ownership across industries, it becomes clear how often their names appear, revealing a pattern where the same firms hold pieces of competing companies, raising concerns about how much true independence remains within these markets. This overlapping influence gives them a kind of soft control that doesn't require day-to-day management, because their financial weight alone encourages corporations to align with expectations that keep the money flowing and leadership stable. Their influence becomes especially strong during shareholder votes because corporations know the big three can shift entire outcomes, guiding who gets board seats, how leadership behaves, and which long-term strategies become priorities across entire industries. Shareholder voting may sound small, yet it directs company rules, workplace standards, compensation plans, and long-term goals, giving the big three a powerful role that shapes decisions affecting millions of workers and consumers. With massive voting stakes, they become major voices inside boardrooms, influencing leadership teams, who recognize that keeping these powerful shareholders satisfied often means securing smoother financial performance and broader institutional support. Over time, this influence pushes CEOs toward decisions that align with the Big Three's expectations, even when those expectations reshape labor practices, business priorities, or investment strategies that affect workers and communities. Their votes often guide how companies manage wages, hiring levels, and workplace standards, which can create pressure for lower labor costs and streamlined structures that ripple through entire industries and impact families dependent on those jobs. Pricing decisions also shift under their influence, because companies aiming to impress large shareholders may focus on efficiency and consolidation, shaping the cost of everyday items in ways consumers feel long before understanding the forces behind them. Their voting power encourages mergers and acquisitions, leading companies to combine in ways that reduce competition, concentrate markets, and create fewer alternatives for customers, often leaving entire regions relying on a handful of corporate giants. Industry-wide changes follow these patterns, as corporations adjust plans, investments, and long-term strategies around the expectations set by the Big Three, who carry enough financial weight to indirectly guide entire sectors. Most people never see these decisions happening, yet the results show up in rising costs, fewer job options, reduced competition, and a sense that large companies everywhere seem to operate with remarkably similar goals and structures. This hidden influence affects daily life far more than most recognize, shaping choices available at stores, mortgages offered by banks, and decisions made by employers, all connected to the financial power held by these quiet giants. Their impact reaches into housing markets, where their influence over real estate funds and property investments shapes availability, competition, and rental pricing trends that affect millions trying to find or keep a stable place to live. Rent prices rise when large financial firms steer property ownership, because the push for steady returns often leads to aggressive rent structures and reduced willingness to keep units affordable for regular families struggling with already tight budgets. Grocery prices shift as well because the Big Three hold positions in the companies that control food production, distribution, and retail, creating pressure to prioritize efficiency and profitability over affordability or variety for consumers. Wage growth slows when companies pursue cost-cutting strategies favored by large shareholders, leaving workers stuck with limited raises even as corporate profits rise, creating a growing disconnect between everyday labor and overall financial performance. Job security becomes fragile when companies lean into restructuring, driven by shareholder expectations, pushing businesses to reduce staff, automate roles, or consolidate operations, reshaping employment patterns across industries. Healthcare companies connected to the Big Three influence the cost of medication, insurance structures, and treatment access, shaping outcomes that affect families, seniors, and anyone navigating a complex and expensive medical system. Banks tied to their ownership adjust lending policies, influence mortgage approvals, and shape credit access, connecting the big three to decisions that determine who can buy homes, build businesses, or recover from financial setbacks. Media companies influenced by their ownership help shape debates seen across screens, guiding narratives that reach millions and affect public opinion, cultural conversations, and the political landscape in ways many never trace back to these firms. Political discussions become shaped indirectly through corporate decisions aligned with the expectations of large shareholders, creating a system where influence flows through financial channels rather than direct public engagement. With so many parts of life connected to companies guided by the big three, the question becomes how far this influence could reach if left unchecked, especially as their holdings grow larger with every automatic contribution from ordinary people. Each new dollar flowing into their funds strengthens a system that gives them increasing control, raising concerns about whether a future dominated by a few financial giants leaves room for true competition, choice, or independence in everyday life. This entire system grew without dramatic headlines, because the shift toward passive investing happened quietly, letting these firms gain influence as a natural byproduct of market trends rather than through bold actions that might have drawn widespread attention. No single law or decision created this power. Instead, it emerged from a mix of convenience, trust, and automation, as people followed the simplest investing path while unknowingly feeding an engine that concentrated ownership at a remarkable speed. Regulatory gaps made it easier for the big three to expand because the structure of index funds gave them enormous voting rights without requiring them to justify or limit how that influence reached across countless companies. Passive investing created a landscape where the largest firms benefited the most because size attracted more investment increased influence, and that influence helped them secure positions that smaller competitors could never match. This cycle reduced opportunities for alternative asset managers, since the big three grew so large that nearly every standard retirement account fed directly into their ecosystem, leaving little room for new challengers to take root. Money naturally gravitates toward the biggest players, and this constant flow strengthens them even during market turbulence, creating a feedback loop where their dominance becomes self-sustaining, deeper, and harder to unwind. Companies rely on these giants for stability, viewing them as dependable long-term owners, whose support helps maintain stock prices, attract investors, and ease concerns during uncertain economic periods. Reinforcing their central role in corporate planning, CEOs and boards now shape strategies around what they believe these large shareholders expect, creating a corporate environment where leadership decisions often reflect assumptions about the preferences of the big three. This influence grows stronger each year because the big three's scale gives them unparalleled visibility into markets, allowing them to guide shifts in behavior simply by signaling preferences that ripple through countless companies trying to stay aligned. Accountability becomes complicated, since these firms answer to millions of investors yet operate with concentrated power, raising concerns about who decides corporate priorities when so many decisions trace back to institutions most people rarely think about. Their reach extends far beyond the United States, because global markets rely heavily on their funds, giving them leverage in Europe's economic landscape and connecting them to major corporations operating across borders. Their presence in European markets influences how companies there approach energy, technology, transportation, and financial regulation, creating a link between international policies and the expectations of US-based asset managers. In Asia, their ownership stakes tie them to expanding industries, from manufacturing to digital services, allowing them to shape investment flows that affect supply chains and production networks relied on by consumers around the world. Emerging markets also feel their presence, because these firms often hold key positions in regional funds that shape development patterns, infrastructure priorities, and long-term planning for countries seeking global investment. Governments privately express concern about the concentration of power held by these firms, because their decisions can influence currency stability, corporate behavior, and public policy discussions in ways that bypass traditional political channels. Global companies depend on the big three for steady investment, meaning that international corporate strategies frequently align with the expectations set by these firms, even without direct conversations or formal guidance. International funds extend their reach further, creating networks of ownership that connect industries, governments, and markets under the influence of a few institutions that quietly guide massive amounts of capital. Decisions made inside the big three ripple across the global economy, affecting trade flows, market confidence, and investment trends that shape opportunities for businesses and workers in many different countries. During global crises, their importance grows even more because investors often rush toward index funds for safety, giving these institutions larger stakes and even greater influence during moments when stability matters most. Their expanding reach raises questions about how large their influence could become, because each crisis, market shift, or trend seems to push more control toward them rather than diversifying it across a wider range of institutions. Automation helps them manage these enormous portfolios, as algorithms distribute money across sectors and companies with far-reaching precision, shaping market movement in ways that amplify their already dominant presence. Algorithms also decide how funds shift between industries, allowing automated systems to indirectly influence which companies grow, which fall behind, and which innovations receive financial support during crucial development stages. These automated flows help shape future industries, guiding money towards sectors like clean energy, artificial intelligence, cloud computing, and healthcare, often long before public attention shifts toward these trends. So, their influence over energy transitions gives them a role in deciding which technologies receive investment, shaping how companies approach renewable energy, fossil fuels, and long-term environmental planning across global markets. They shape technology standards through their ownership in major tech firms, affecting how digital platforms evolve, how privacy rules adjust, and which innovations gain momentum, linking technological progress directly to decisions made inside these powerful institutions. Their decisions echo through smaller companies that rely on industry stability because when major corporations shift strategies under the influence of large shareholders, smaller firms feel pressured to follow those same patterns to avoid being left behind. This pressure can limit choices for consumers, since industries begin to move in similar directions, reducing variety and creating markets where many companies appear different on the surface but operate with nearly identical priorities and strategies. The influence also places stress on entrepreneurial innovation, because startups may struggle to compete in sectors where the Big Three back established players, creating an environment where new ideas face significant hurdles before gaining real traction. Smaller businesses often adjust their plans to align with broader trends supported by these financial giants, which gradually shifts the entire economy toward a narrower set of outcomes, shaped by a handful of institutional preferences. This raises long-term concerns about a future where financial decisions made by a few institutions have more influence than consumer demand, shaping markets in ways that limit independence and reduce opportunities for alternatives. Individuals become part of this system through their savings, because retirement accounts, investment apps, and pension plans direct money toward funds managed by these firms, connecting personal financial futures to the decisions of distant institutions. Pension funds rely heavily on the Big Three to grow long-term value, meaning millions depend on the performance of these firms without directly choosing how their money is used or which companies receive their support. Index fund investors also become tied to this system because their contributions reach companies across many sectors, forming a network of ownership that gives the Big Three influence over almost every major corner of the economy. For many people, retirement security now depends on the steady performance of the Big Three's portfolios, creating a situation where personal financial stability relies on a system dominated by a few players with extraordinary reach. Fees and policy decisions within these funds shape long-term outcomes for savers, because even small adjustments can influence how much people gain over decades, linking household financial futures to decisions made far above their everyday lives. Their influence also reaches job markets indirectly, because companies aligned with shareholder expectations may restructure, automate, or shift strategies in ways that reshape employment opportunities, affecting careers across multiple industries. Connections between education, healthcare, and housing all link back to corporate decisions influenced by the Big Three, creating a network where essential parts of everyday life move in response to the priorities of a few investment giants. Small investors hold little voting power in comparison because their individual stakes barely register in corporate decisions, leaving the Big Three to determine outcomes that shape company policies for millions of people with minimal input from the public. This concentrated control makes choices feel limited, because when numerous companies follow similar strategies shaped by the same institutional investors, consumers face fewer meaningful options in markets that once seemed diverse and competitive. Many start to wonder what regular people can actually do in a system where influence flows upward, especially when the institutions guiding the economy operate quietly and without the visibility people usually expect from powerful decision-makers. Experts debate the risk of concentrated ownership, pointing out that this much influence in the hands of a few firms creates vulnerabilities that could affect stability, competition, and fairness across the entire economic landscape. Some warn that too much power held by too few institutions could create potential control over markets that rivals the authority of governments, raising questions about transparency, oversight, and the true distribution of economic power. Lawmakers discuss possible reforms, but separating influence from such large entities is difficult, because these firms manage money for millions who depend on them, making any major change a challenge with unpredictable consequences. Regulating institutions of this size is complicated because their reach spans global markets, international funds, and countless corporate relationships, creating a web of connections that makes oversight slow and complex. The economy depends on the stability these firms provide, since sudden disruptions could shake markets, affect retirement accounts, and create uncertainty for businesses counting on predictable investment support to maintain operations. Unwinding their influence could destabilize markets, because removing such large players too quickly might disrupt share prices, pension funds, and entire industries heavily reliant on them for long-term investment. Allowing things to continue unchanged, however, could deepen concentration even further, giving these firms increasing control over markets, industries, and corporate strategies as their assets grow year after year. Any meaningful shift will require awareness because people rarely question the structure of markets they rely on, yet understanding who controls the companies shaping everyday life is the first step toward addressing the imbalance. Everything circles back to one central question: who truly steers the future when the most powerful decisions no longer come from individual companies, voters, or governments, but from institutions whose names most people barely recognize? As their influence grows with every automatic contribution and expanding portfolio, the future of competition, pricing, jobs, and financial independence may hinge on whether society continues to overlook the rise of these financial giants or chooses to confront their power,